Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everybody, my name is Ibrahim Zaki and today I would like to give some knowledge about forms in HTML. So as you can see here from the first page, we're going to talk about forms. Let me fix my camera for a while. Sorry. First, first of all, we need to know what is form. So basically, a form in HTML is an element or that is a container element for different types of input elements. So yeah, so HTML form element is a container element that contains input elements, label elements, and all those stuff that makes it interesting. Here you can see an example of it. There's an HTML form with the input elements. These are the input elements, and these are also input elements. So, what is input elements? We can see here input. There are many input elements here. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. So there are seven input elements in one HTML form. So what is an input element? An input element represents a type data field, usually with a form control to allow the user to edit the data. The type attribute controls the data type and associated control of the element. So yeah, there are so many HTML input elements, but here I'm only going to discuss 14 input elements. First is text input elements. Second is submit input element, color input element, and then the fourth is data time local input element, and fifth is file input element. Six is range input element. Seven is number input element. Eight is button input element. 9 is checkbox input element. 10 is data element. 11 is email element, hidden element, radio element, and password element. I'm not going to discuss all of them. I'm only going to discuss about the importance. So the first one is text input type. So here there are many, right? There are many, but I'm going to discuss only some of them. First is text input type. So the text input type or the text input element type is the default type of input element. It defines a single line text input. So as you can see here, it's written first name, and we can write here in so how to make an input a text type input element is typed by typing input type and set the type property into text, and the ID and the name you can write anything you want. And then there is submit input element. The input type defines a button for submitting form data to a form handler. The form handler is typically a server page with a script for processing input data. The form handler is specified in the form's action attribute. And this is the example of a submit input type. Input with a type property as submit. And the value is what is written here, submit. And then next, we have color input type. The color input type is used for input fields that should contain a color. Depending on browser support, a color picker can show up in the input field. So it depends on your browser. If, for example, if you're using Firefox, it appears, and you are using Chrome, it doesn't appear. So yeah, color input type or color picker input type depends on your browser. And how to make it is like it's just by typing input with a type property color, and you'll get this. And then data time local input type. The data time local input type specifies a date and time input field with no time zone. Depending on browser support, a date picker can show up in the input field. So again, it depends on your browser. And how to make it is by typing input with the type property data time local. Next, we have file input type. The file input type defines a file select field and a browse button for file uploads. It can be used for almost every type of file. As you can see here, choose file and no choose file. I mean here choose file. So how to make it is just by typing input with the type properties file and the ID and name. You can type whatever you want. And then we have range input type, which defines a control for entering a number whose exact value is not important. Default range is 0 to 100. However, you can set restrictions on what numbers are accepted with the min, max, and step attributes. So here, input with a property type, with a type property as range, and with minimum property 0 and max property 50, and you'll get this. And then there's number input type, which defines a numeric input field. You can also set restrictions on what numbers are accepted. The following example displays a number input field where you can enter a value from 1 to 5. So here, there's again the minimum property as 1 and the maximum property as 5. And how to make it is just by typing input with the property type with type property number. And then we have button input type, which defines a button, of course, and just you can make it but just by typing input type the type property as button and the value, click me and you'll get this. And then there is checkbox input type, which defines a checkbox lets a user that select zero or more options of a limited number of choices. For example, label for vehicle 2 is I have a car, and you'll get this. I mean, input oh sorry input with the property type text box. And we have password input type. The password input type defines a password field. So basically the thing that you see in sign in login with name password is using input with property type password. So here, and this is what you get. And then before we see label elements is also important in forms. So what are label elements? Label elements you are for yeah, it's just used for making your forms look more eye-catching. So here we can see an example of it. For example, if you make label for with a property type with a property for as username, the for attribute is set to username, which matches the ID of the corresponding input element, ID username, which creates an explicit association between the label and the input field. and then you and then you type another thing. You type input with a for example here with a property type text, and then use the ID username like the label is. So this should be same. The for and the ID should be same. The input field for the username has an ID that matches the for attribute as its label. So the advantage of when you click label with its property for the same as one of the input with the same ID, it will correspond. So if you type the label, the input will automatically activate. So label advantages. So there are some you can read it by yourself. Improves form accessibility and usability. Ensures better user experience by making the form controls easier to identify and interact with. As I said before, provides support for screen readers to identify form controls and their purposes. So yeah, screen readers are annoying most of times. That's why we use labels. And then the name property. As before, we could see ID and name property. And what are name property? So name property of an HTML input element is a crucial attribute that defines the name of the input control. When a form is submitted, the data contained in the input field is sent to the server with the key corresponding to the name attribute. This is especially in form assessing, as the server-side script uses the name attribute to retrieve corresponding value. And I guess that's it from me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Sanfir Ramzaki, and goodbye.